Today we're continuing through our journey through the life of David. I know we've been doing this for quite a while. I'm telling you, I think it's only 2 more weeks, this week and next. But it's so powerful to look at his life. There's so much to look at. And as I was even thinking about it this week, aren't you glad you're not parsed apart like David is? Think if your whole life was there for us all to look at. Whew, that'd be scary, right? What would that look like? But this is David. And last week, after years of waiting, we finally saw him crowned king over all the land, over all of God's people. You know, when you think of David, many different thoughts and even descriptions come to mind. We know he's a shepherd, and that's how we're first introduced to him, taking care of his dad's sheep. We know David's a warrior. This man defeated Goliath, and besides just defeating Goliath, he won battle after battle after battle. We know David is king, and we also know David is a psalmist. He wrote over 70 to 75 of the Psalms that we read in the Bible. And we also know one of the distinguishing characteristics of David is that he is a man and was a man after God's own heart. It can be hard to remember that as you look at everything that he goes through. Paul says this in Acts 13. He said, God removed Saul and replaced him with David, a man about whom God said, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. That's what it looks like. He will do everything I want him to do. Simply put, David wanted what God wanted. David wanted what God wanted. God found David to be a man that cared about what God cared about. That's what it means, and that's what it looks like. And as you continue to look at the life of David, not only was he a psalmist, but really he was such a worshiper, a very passionate worshiper of God. You see it not only in the words that he writes, but also in his actions, as we will see today. And we're going to look at that. The worship of David is what we're going to be looking at today. You know, when the topic does come up, you instantly, when you look at the Bible, I think of the Psalms, of which David wrote many of them. And David worshiped with all of his heart, and he really begins to exemplify the true meaning of praise and worship. For David's deepest desire was for God's presence. It says in Psalm 26, I love your sanctuary, Lord, the place where your glorious presence dwells. That's what David loves. He writes again in the next psalm, the one thing I ask of the Lord, listen to this, the one thing I ask, the thing that I seek the most is to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. That is how much he wanted God's presence in his life. The one thing he asks, the one thing that he seeks the most is to live in the house of the Lord where God resides all the days of his life. David's number one desire is God. It was the number one ambition that controlled his heart and mind. And you continue to look at his Psalms and you understand this. Not only did he desire God's presence, but David craved God. He writes in Psalm 63, O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you. In this parched and weary land where there is no water, I long for you. Like I crave coffee in the morning or Coke with pizza, David craved God. That is how David was. And so as we jump into this in 2 Samuel 6, we're going to see some interesting facets of worship. Because 2 Samuel 6 is a very interesting chapter. David again has become king as we read in 2 Samuel 5, and now he has something he wants to get done. He wants to get the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, and bring it to Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant represented something far more than just a simple religious artifact. It was the very symbol of God's presence among his people. This wooden chest, if you will, contained the law of Moses, Aaron's rod that had budded, and it contained the jar of manna. It was one of the most instrumental symbols of faith and of the very presence of God, which is why David wanted it where he was, and who wouldn't? So let's begin to look at this in 2 Samuel 6. It says, he led them to Bela of Judah to bring back the ark of God, which bears the name of the Lord of heaven's armies. They placed the ark of God, verse 3, on a new cart and brought it from Abinadab's house, which was on a hill. Uzzah and Ahio, Abinadab's sons, were guiding the ark that carried the ark of God. Ahio walked in front. David and all the people were celebrating, having a great time. Verse 6, when they arrived at the threshing floor, the oxen stumbled. Uzzah reached out his hand and steadied the ark of God. The Lord's anger was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him dead because of this. So Uzzah died right there beside the ark of God. How's this going to do with worship? You'll see. This is a tragedy. The more you jump into this, though, some really simple and powerful truths pop out at you. First thing you notice is David failed to consult God. You know, in chapter 5, the Philistines have amassed against the Israelites, and both times David seeks God about what he should do. So now he's transporting the ark of God, and nowhere in here does he consult God. He failed to consult him. Book of Chronicles, where David mentions this, David consulted with all of his officials, including the generals and captain of the army. He didn't consult God, but he consulted others. For when you read the Bible, you understand God had a way for the Ark of the Covenant to be transported or trouble would ensue. We all know this from watching the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Duh! There are certain things you can't do. But they didn't have that movie yet, so they didn't know. God had a way for the ark to be transported. There were poles that were supposed to slide into it, not by a cart. But you know what? They had used a cart to transport it previously. Why did that work? We want to know why it worked? That was the Philistines that did that. They didn't know any better. They didn't have the law or God's word. And something powerful about that. David and the Israelites were copying the custom of the heathen Philistines. Think about that. They were copying what the Philistines did to transport the very presence of God. And there were explicit instructions on how this ark was to be transported. Oh my gosh, when I read that and was looking at that this week, I'm going, they're doing just what the Philistines did, who did not know God. We should know better. We should know better. And that's what they should have known better. God had stated that only the sons of Kohath from the Levite tribe could transport it. You could not touch it. You had to use poles. That's what they were for, so you could lift up the poles and it would transport the ark. Yet they ignored that. David, all the Jewish people ignored these rules and transported the ark on an animal cart. And disaster ensued. You see, this passage begins to reveal something about God. And it's His immense holiness. The holiness of God, when we begin to grasp this, it draws us into worship of God. And it's something that we fail to fully grasp. R.C. Sproul said some powerful words about this. And I came across it, ready for this, on Instagram. Instagram has some redeeming qualities. He said there is only one attribute of God that is magnified in Scripture to the third degree of repetition. He is holy, holy, holy. The only attribute. And I don't like to say long quotes, but this one is just so powerful because he goes on to say this. The Bible doesn't say that God is mercy, mercy, mercy. Just. Love, 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 or wrath, wrath, wrath. But that He is holy, holy, holy. This is a dimension of God that consumes His very essence. When it's manifest to Isaiah, we read that at the sound of the voices of the seraphim, the doorpost, the thresholds of the temple itself shook and began to tremble. Do you hear that? Inanimate, lifeless, unintelligible parts of creation in the presence of the manifestation of the holiness of God had the good sense to be moved. How can we, made in His image, be indifferent or apathetic to His majesty? God alone is holy. And I read that and I go, no wonder Uzzah was struck dead for having laid hands on the ark. Our God is holy. That ark could not be touched. And something you notice about this whole story, not only is God just this holy God, not only did they fail to consult God, but you understand something, that God is concerned about the details. God is concerned about the details of life. those parts and areas of our life that we deem unimportant, God deems important. For God is concerned with every aspect and facet of our lives. And what happened in this story is David and the people took the easy route and attempted to transport the ark in a way that was not prescribed. You know, sometimes you'll hear the statement, it doesn't matter what you do, just do something even if it's wrong. That's a horrible way to live, because that's what they did. And I wonder how often we make that same little mistake. Because what you see going on here is David and the people, they were presuming upon the Lord instead of seeking His guidance. And that word just kept popping in my mind this week, for how easy it can be to fall into the trap of presuming upon God. To presume that we know better. To presume and not seek. And what happens is we begin to take God for granted. We take His grace for granted. We take His mercy for granted. And we grow rather flippant about the very holiness of God. You know, when you presume upon someone, you don't really ask for permission. And this is what got David into trouble and cost Uzzah his life. You know, David later explained to the priests that God was upset not with just Uzzah, but with all the leaders. He writes, "We did not carry the ark in the right way at the first. Because of this, the Lord our God made an outburst on us, for we did not seek Him according to the law." You know, it's interesting about Uzzah's name. Ironically, it means strength. Yeah, his name means strength, and he relied upon his own strength to protect and save this ark. The results are never good when we rely on our own strength. And that's what we see in this story. So I'm telling you, when we begin to understand just a little bit of the holiness of God, it will draw us into worship of Him. Holiness draws us into worship. And as the story continues, in verse 8, it says David was angry. David was angry with God, when in reality, God was angry with David. Isn't that how we are? How many times have I been angry or upset with God over my own misdeeds of reaping what I have sown? And we get angry at God, and God's like, what are you doing? What do you like that for? Verse 9, David was now afraid of the Lord, and I can't blame him. And he asked, how can I ever bring the ark of the Lord back into my care? And it's interesting because this is such a powerful topic. You have the holiness of God, and then you see fear descending upon David. And I'll tell you right now, fear of God draws you into worship. Holiness draws you. Fear of God draws you. Fear descended upon David, and that fear and that reverence drew him deeper into worship of God. Just like the holiness of God, fear of God is an acknowledgement of the greatness and awesomeness of God. We become in awe of who He is. We become reminded of what He's done for us and reminded of what He can do. Fear is such an interesting emotion. You know, like all emotions, they are there for a reason. Fear is a reaction to your environment or your perceived environment. Think about it. Came across a great example. If you had a fear of spiders, which I do, and if there was a spider in your bedroom, I guarantee you wouldn't be thinking about anything else other than where that spider is and what he's doing. You know, there was a time in our life, Robin and I had the opportunity to live in Arizona. And we lived on the outskirts of Scottsdale where wildlife dwells. And I was scared of one thing about moving to Arizona. If there is a tarantula in my house, what will I do? And it was interesting as we worked at a school, and in one of the classrooms, the 7th grade classroom, they had a fish aquarium in there, and the kids had a huge scorpion and a huge tarantula in that to see who would defeat it. Yeah, not me. I didn't like to go to that room. But I do remember this story. This is my hatred of spiders. We had people at our house, and they were leaving, and I opened the door for them, and there on my doorstep was a tarantula. You would think I would shoo it and get it away. I shut the door and went into another room. I hate spiders. But that's all I could think about. The fear of that spider consumed me. And I waited to come out. And I went out, and these Arizona people, they didn't kill it. They shooed it away. I'm like, what? It's still alive? I mean, that's just me. But see, when you have a fear of something, that's all you can think about. I wasn't thinking about what was for lunch. I wasn't thinking about what was on TV. I wasn't thinking about my finances. All I could think about was that tarantula. My only concern was that spider. One commentator said about fear, what we fear is what we are subject to. Think about that. And he goes on and says it defines our master. So if you're not fearing God, what are you fearing? You know, it's interesting is that fear has a way of triggering something in your brain, kind of like pain tells you something is wrong. Fear tells you either something is missing or that something is there. Like when you have a big project due, you have this healthy stress that helps you get the job done. I'll tell you this, a healthy fear of God makes you more aware of Him. A healthy fear makes us more and more aware of God, which David is. He realizes he must seek God to get the ark back to Jerusalem. Because I know this about the fear of God, it gets you to seek Him. And the more you seek God and the more you fear God and you realize this awesome power of God, it draws us closer to Him and it will drive you and cause you to worship Him because you realize He's worthy of it. You know, it's interesting, in the New Testament, one of the first times we have the disciples fearing Jesus was when He calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee. The storm is raging and Jesus commands His creation to stop and His great calm descends upon the sea. The disciples aren't giving each other high five. They're not singing hip hip hooray. This is what they do. It says they were filled with great fear because of what Jesus did. And they said, "Who then is this that even the wind and sea obey Him?" The New Living Translation says the disciples were absolutely terrified. Suddenly, the disciples were more afraid of this man in the boat with them than they were of the storm. See, what are we fearing? What controls us? They had seen something of the power and awesomeness of Jesus. Because I've noticed this about fear, as I've just said, as we focus on what we fear. The disciples had been afraid of the sea, and that fear enveloped them. All the while, the Creator was sleeping right there in their boat. I'm going to tell you, when you begin to fear God, it draws you into worship, and it draws your focus and your attention on God. One thing I really love about that story on the Sea of Galilee is the storm didn't wake Jesus. The disciples did. Jesus was sleeping. And so when you hear us talk about the peace of Jesus that He gives you, this is what I'm talking about. Is that even in the midst of the storm that you're facing right now, you can have peace. In the midst of the storm that we see raging in our world, that doesn't mean it needs to steal your peace. Because Jesus was able to rest rather comfortably in the midst of a storm. I've been on a cruise ship, and we had some waves hitting. And this was not a cruise ship, but I got nauseous on that ship. Can you imagine what a storm would be like on the Sea of Galilee in a boat? Yet He's asleep. When we say He's the Prince of Peace, this is what we're talking about. When we're saying He's giving you a peace that the world cannot give, this is what we mean. Yet we're like the disciples running around with our heads cut off. What do we do? What do we do? Because we're focused on the wrong aspect. We're not focused on Jesus. We're fearing the storm. I want to fear Jesus who can calm that storm. That's extra. There we keep going. You can't miss that. That's just powerful, what Jesus does. Anyway, verse 10. David decided not to move the ark of the Lord because he was so afraid. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom of Gath. The ark of the Lord remained there in Obed-Edom's house for 3 months. I don't want you to miss this. This is another little rabbit trail. The Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. Where the presence of God is, there is blessing. The presence of God was with this man. They were all blessed. Doesn't say just a little bit. Doesn't say some of them, but they were all blessed. Is the presence of God in your home? Is He? Do you welcome God in your home? Do you? It doesn't mean life is a bed of roses, but it means there is blessings because you're acknowledging God. And there is a difference. There's blessings where the presence of God resides. The whole household was blessed. Anyway, I just think that is so powerful, and you can't miss that. The ark of God, the presence of God, was in their home, and there were blessings. Goes on in verse 13, so David finally figures out how to do this the correct way. And so they're carrying the ark of the Lord the right way, the way God prescribed. So we have the holiness of God. We have the fear of God draws us into this worship. And it says, after the men who were carrying the ark had gone 6 steps, David sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. David danced before the Lord with all of his might, wearing a priestly garment. David and all the people of Israel brought up the ark with shouts of joy and the blowing of ram's horns. They're now transporting the ark the correct way, and David is dancing with all his might. As Charles Swindoll notes, when you obey, you're free. When you obey, you're free. Disobedience leads to bondage. We live lives around people who are in bondage, yet we are free. We are free. Maybe we need to be reminded, but we are free. We should not only live like it, but we should worship like it. People in bondage, understand this. People who are not free will have a problem with your freedom. Look no further than David's wife, Saul's daughter Michal, not happy with David. She's in bondage. You see, people that are in bondage aren't happy that you can be free, that you can have peace in the midst of turmoil, that you can have joy in the midst of tragedy. Why? Because you're free. It's a big difference. And David is celebrating with all the people of Israel. And notice he's wearing a priestly garment. David has removed his kingly robes to worship before the Lord. Humility breeds worship. Worship breeds humility. They go hand in hand. And this is what you see about David. One leads to the other. True worship always requires laying down our pride before God. David, the king of all the land, has laid down his robes and his kingly garments, and he's worshiping with all of his might in front of everyone, for he lays down all of his pretense. David is willing to be vulnerable and unashamed in his worship of God. And he laid down his pride and his pretense, because here's the thing about this. Worship places God in the center of your life. If you have pride, then you're the center. But when you have humility, you're making God the center. And worship places God in the center of your life. You see, David wanted the ark back in Jerusalem, and he's literally bringing God into the center of his kingdom. It's not us, it's God. This can be so difficult for our flesh to acknowledge. It can be rather humbling. Yet when we rightly begin to have a fear of God, to understand the holiness of God, this should drive us to our knees, to take off our crowns and all of our achievements and place them at the feet of God. You know, if the truth of who God is and what He has done for us doesn't humble us, then perhaps we're not understanding or comprehending who God is in the right manner. For no one thinking of God's power, of God's holiness, can still think highly of themselves. David, the king over all the land, laid it all down to worship God. The central question in worship boils down to not what I feel like, but what God is worthy of. Because the truth of the matter is we're all worshiping something. David Foster Wallace said, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. We all worship. We worship money. We worship jobs. We worship our intellect. We worship our power, our success. We worship our relationship. I'm going to tell you something about all of that. All of those things, it doesn't matter if it's your spouse, they end up disappointing you. And not only that, they end up controlling us. For what we worship controls us. We see this with sports fans, myself included. What we worship controls us. It can control us. And I'm going to tell you, whatever we worship that is not God will let you down. Fear of God draws us to worship. Holiness of God drives us to worship. I'm going to say this, and you can't miss this. There's blessing in worship. When David had finished his sacrifices, David blessed the people in the name of the Lord. Then he gave to every Israelite man and woman in the crown a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins. I don't have that for you today. Then all the people returned to their homes. They all worshiped. They were all blessed.